Imagine standing on a perfect Mediterranean beach. The water is clear. The sand stretches for miles. Behind you are enormous hotels, apartment towers, restaurants, shops, balconies facing the sea. It looks like the kind of place where thousands of tourists should be arriving every summer. But look closer. The windows are broken. The buildings are fading. Some balconies are collapsing. Plants have pushed through places once filled with people. And for decades, almost nobody was allowed inside. This is not an unfinished resort. It is not a movie set. And it was not abandoned because the money ran out. People actually lived here. People worked here. Families owned homes here. Tourists traveled from other countries to stay here. Then, in 1974, tens of thousands of people fled. And instead of returning when the fighting stopped, they found their city behind fences. This is Varosha. And the strangest thing about Varosha is not that it was abandoned. It is that for almost half a century, the city remained there, waiting. Before everything changed, Varosha was part of Famagusta on the eastern coast of Cyprus. Today, photographs of the abandoned towers make the place look dark and almost unreal. But before 1974, the picture was completely different. Varosha was one of the Mediterranean's glamorous beach destinations. White sand, modern hotels, restaurants, nightlife, apartment buildings overlooking the water. Tourists came for the beaches and the warm Mediterranean climate. For the people who lived there, however, this was not an exotic and Vatican city. It was simply home. They had houses, businesses, jobs, schools, neighborhoods, normal lives. Nobody living there could have known that the streets around them would soon become some of the most famous abandoned streets in the world. The story begins with something much bigger than Varosha. Cyprus had already been living through years of tension between Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot communities. Then came 1974. In July, a coup backed by the military government ruling Greece targeted the government of Cyprus. The political situation exploded. Days later, Turkey launched a military operation on the island. The fighting did not end there. In August, Turkish forces began another major military advance. And this time, the direction of that advance placed Famagusta directly in danger. Imagine hearing that armed forces are approaching your city. You do not know exactly what will happen. You do not know how long you will be gone. You only know that staying could be dangerous. People began leaving. Residents of Varosha joined the wider movement of civilians fleeing the fighting. According to research from the Peace Research Institute Oslo, around 30,000 Greek Cypriots, many from Varosha, fled from the north to the south during the division of the island. Varosha was evacuated. Turkish troops occupied the area. And then something happened that transformed an evacuation into a mystery lasting generations. Varosha was fenced off. Barbed wire appeared around the district. Access became heavily restricted. The residents who had fled did not simply return when the immediate fighting ended. The city stayed closed. Think about what that means. A functioning tourist district filled with hotels and apartment buildings suddenly had almost no normal civilian life inside it. The Mediterranean was still there. The beach was still there. The towers were still standing. But the people were gone. Months passed. Then years. The buildings began aging without ordinary maintenance. Windows broke. Metal rusted. Vegetation spread. Walls cracked. The once famous hotels facing the sea slowly became empty shells. And outside the fences, former residents could see that their city still existed. They simply could not return to normal life there. That is where Varosha becomes far stranger than most abandoned places. Usually, when a hotel closes, somebody eventually buys it, or renovates it, or demolishes it. When an entire neighborhood becomes unusable, buildings eventually disappear and something new replaces them. But Varosha became trapped inside one of Europe's longest unresolved political conflicts. It was not simply a collection of abandoned buildings. It became part of negotiations over the future of Cyprus. The United Nations Security Council became directly involved in the question of what should happen there. In 1984, the Security Council adopted a resolution stating that attempts to settle any part of Varosha with people other than its inhabitants were inadmissible. It called for the area to be transferred to the administration of the United Nations. Later, United Nations decisions continued to address Varosha, but the political dispute remained unresolved. And so the years kept passing. Imagine leaving your home believing that you are escaping a dangerous moment, then realizing that the moment has become a year, then 5 years, then 10, then 20. Your old neighborhood is still there. Your street still exists. The building where you once lived may still be standing, but you are growing older somewhere else. And the city is growing older without you. That human part of Varosha is easy to lose when looking at photographs. People call it a ghost town. They photograph the ruins. They talk about the strange hotels. But behind those buildings were thousands of individual lives. Properties had owners. Homes had families. Businesses represented years of work. For many displaced residents, Varosha was not a mysterious attraction. It was something they had lost. And outside the fences, an entire generation grew up knowing a city that existed physically but remained inaccessible to them. For decades, photographs taken near the restricted area helped create Varosha's strange reputation. Tower after tower facing one of the most beautiful coastlines in Cyprus. Empty, silent, decaying, not destroyed by some ancient disaster, not buried by a volcano, not swallowed by the ocean, just left standing. And because access was so restricted, the imagination filled the empty spaces. What did the inside of those hotels look like? What remained inside the apartments? How much had survived? How much had disappeared? How long could the buildings continue standing? And most importantly, would Varosha ever open again? For decades, nobody had a simple answer. Then in October 2020, something happened that would have been almost unimaginable years earlier. Parts of Varosha were open to civilian visitors. After approximately 46 years, people could walk through sections of the district again. But this was not the simple ending of the ghost city. It created another political crisis. The United Nations Security Council expressed concern and called for the decision involving the opening of Varosha's coastline to be reversed. The Security Council reaffirmed earlier resolutions concerning the district. The dispute had entered a new phase. Now visitors could enter certain areas. They could see roads that had spent decades behind restrictions. They could stand between damaged buildings. They could look toward hotels that had once represented the height of Mediterranean tourism. But large areas remained restricted. And the fundamental questions surrounding Varosha had not disappeared. Who ultimately decides its future? That question remains important today. A United Nations report published in 2026 stated that the Security Council's demand for the reversal of measures taken in Varosha since October 2020 had not been implemented. The Secretary General also repeated concern about the situation in the fenced part of the district. So Varosha is no longer accurately described as a city where absolutely nobody can enter. Parts have been opened. Visitors have returned to certain sections. Some facilities have undergone work. But the reason the story is fascinating remains unchanged. The city never received a normal ending. It did not simply collapse and disappear. It did not return completely to the people who had lived there. It did not become an ordinary functioning resort again. Instead, Varosha spent decade after decade caught between the past and an unresolved future, and that creates some extraordinary scenes. A road can look almost normal until you notice what surrounds it. A tall hotel stands beside a beautiful beach, but its rooms have been empty for decades. An apartment balcony faces the Mediterranean, but the family connected to that property may have built an entirely different life somewhere else. Modern visitors move through selected streets, while nearby buildings remain behind barriers. The contrast is almost impossible to understand until you see it. Blue water, bright sunshine, palm trees, and decaying towers. There is another uncomfortable thought hidden inside Varosha. When we imagine abandoned civilizations, we usually imagine something ancient. Ruins buried beneath forests. Cities lost hundreds or thousands of years ago. Varosha shows how quickly a modern city can become something that looks ancient. There was no need for centuries. There were people alive when Varosha was a thriving resort who are still alive today. Some remember walking those streets before the fences existed. Some remember their homes. Some remember leaving. For them, 1974 is not archaeology. It is memory. And that may be the most disturbing part of the entire story, because Varosha was never truly forgotten. Everybody knew where it was. Its buildings were visible. Its beach was visible. Its location appeared on maps. Governments discussed it. The United Nations discussed it. Former residents talked about it. Journalists photographed it. Tourists stared at it from outside restricted areas. The city was not lost. It was right there. And still, decade after decade, it remained largely frozen. That is what makes Varosha different. There is no mystery about where the city went. The mystery is how an entire modern resort could remain physically present while normal life disappeared from it for so long. Today, the fences no longer hide everything. Parts of Varosha can be visited. The outside world has finally entered streets that were inaccessible for generations. But opening a road is much easier than resolving what happened there. Behind every abandoned hotel is a history. Behind many apartment buildings is a property claim. Behind the empty streets is a political conflict that has lasted longer than many of the buildings were originally designed to survive. And somewhere beneath all of that, there is another Varosha. The Varosha people remember. The city before the broken windows, before the fences, before the military posts, before tourists arrived to photograph the ruins. The place where people woke up, opened their shops, walked to work, looked out toward the Mediterranean, and assumed tomorrow would look more or less like today. Then history arrived, and tomorrow never came. More than half a century after the evacuation, the hotels are still there. The beach is still there. Many of the buildings are still there. And the argument over Varosha is still not finished. Perhaps that is why photographs of this place feel so unsettling. You are not looking at a city destroyed and forgotten. You are looking at a city that everyone remembered, but nobody could simply put back the way it was. For decades, Varosha waited behind fences while the world around it changed. People were born. People grew old. Governments changed. Hotels were built in other cities. Tourists found other beaches. Entire generations passed. And through all of it, those empty towers continued facing the sea. waiting for an ending that still has not completely arrived.